You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. I'm Sam Sims. I'm a lecturer at UCL Institute of Education, and today we're going to be talking with Dr. Kaori Kitagawa. H.G. Wells famously said that history is a race between education and catastrophe. And with COP26 climate conference being held in Glasgow on the 31st of October this year, we're focusing this season of Research for the Real World on the climate crisis and the role of education in helping to avoid and mitigate climate change. Kaori is an associate professor in the Department of Education, Practice and Society, where her work focuses on disaster risk reduction and preparedness, public pedagogy, and lifelong learning. She's also associated with the Disaster Prevention Research Institute at Kyoto University. Today, we're going to be discussing natural disasters, many of which have been made more likely or more severe by climate change, and how we can better educate and prepare people to protect us when climate disasters do occur. Kaori, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Sam.
Let's start at the beginning. How did you get involved in education and education research?
My interest has always been not mainstream education. So unlike you, Sam, I have looked at adult education, informal learning, non-formal learning, and therefore lifelong learning. And from there, I looked at community learning. That kind of led me to disaster education and disaster risk reduction, preparedness, that area.
Let's dive right in. What is exactly disaster risk reduction and how does it interface with education?
Some years ago, this area was called disaster management. So the idea was we human beings are able to manage disasters. However, since the 1995 Kobe earthquake, I don't know if you were born, Sam, but since then there was a paradigm shift, that disasters cannot be managed, it cannot be stopped, but we have to cope with them and learn how to reduce their risks. So from there, the idea of disaster risk reduction was introduced rather than disaster management. That's the mainstream. And in order to manage disaster risks, we have to prepare, we have to learn how to do so. That is actually education in a broad sense. So when I use the word education, I use it in a broad sense. So it's more probably appropriate to say learning and teaching, or learning about disasters and learning for disaster.
Interesting, yeah. And I mean, I'm quite young, but I definitely was alive in 1995. I can confirm. Okay, and so I assume this line of research that you're in has kind of taken you to lots of interesting and potentially troubled places around the world. Are there particular disasters that you've observed or disaster zones that you've visited in the course of your research?
I have to clarify my kinds of positionality with the disaster research I do, because I feel I'm not qualified to do disaster risk reduction, if you like. Colleagues who have studied disaster risk reduction management, and so therefore how to train people, how to save people, they are the ones, or frontliners, they are the ones who can do this. But I feel I'm not trained to do that. So I study those people or those activities and how do they engage with communities. So I don't necessarily go out to disaster, areas or straight after the disasters. So my stance is probably slightly different from many of the disaster researchers. But I'm taking very different angle from many of disaster researchers, I believe. And that's, I think, is interesting in itself.
And so, which kind of areas, at-risk areas, or disasters have you studied in your academic work?
So I'm originally from Japan and I'm currently here. So Japan is the my primary kind of research field, and Japan is a disaster-prone country, and it has a rich or it's not a positive thing to say, but it has a rich experience of disasters, and research has been done a lot, and there's a lot of new ideas, new models, both soft and hard. By soft, I mean like education and preparedness. By hard, I mean more kind of engineering preparedness, like the dikes and water gates and those kind of stuff. In both areas, Japan has got expertise, and also disaster wise too, that it can have more geological disasters like earthquakes and tsunami and volcanoes. I don't know if you knew we have more than 100 volcanoes, active volcanoes in Japan. Yeah, it is scary. And also, we have a lot of typhoons and torrential rains. And so it's a mismatch of all sorts of hazards in Japan. And I also went to Thailand once, and I had a small case study there too, looking at the 2011 massive great flood, and that was one of the countries I've been. And I also did some research in the UK too, looking at again kind of community engagement in flood risk management.
Okay, yeah, and I know that one of your main interests, Kaori, is around participatory kind of research and education with the local communities who are at risk of disasters. Can you tell us a bit more about what that looks like in practice and what you think it can achieve?
Yeah, of course. It's a buzzword. And I have noticed it's a buzzword in many different disciplines, participation, to promote kind of democratic processes and collaborative activities. So in case of disaster risk reduction, or even post-disaster context, maybe that's easier to imagine. So if a disaster hit, let's say an earthquake in Tohoku region we had in 2011, you have to go through the relief process and then reconstruction. Then you will have to work together with experts and policymakers and maybe donors how to rebuild your community, including your housings and facilities. So in that process, there's a strong incentive to include community members, local people, residents in the decision making process. So that's one form of participatory approach. But in preparedness, before disaster hits, there are a lot of activities ongoing activities as well. For example, let's say again in Japan, there is a region in a south coast. Japan is an island, so south coast in a wide area, Nankai Trough earthquake is supposed to hit within 30 years with a probability of 80%. And one area in southwest Shikoku Island, there is a prefecture called Kochi Prefecture. That particular area, there is an estimate that 34-meter tsunami could hit one area of that prefecture.
Just to clarify, so this area of Japan, it's known or it's estimated that there's an 80% probability of an earthquake happening in the near future, and it could be, we hope not, very large. And the job of disaster risk reduction education is to prepare the people there, not just with dikes or flood barriers or whatever, but rather to give them the knowledge they need in order to reduce the risk and the damage when that does happen. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. And why this came to the fore is after 2011 Tohoku disaster, the Japanese government did a revision on all probable earthquakes, forthcoming earthquakes. So the new announcement was made in 2012, and some of the areas were specifically kind of targeted because of this scale of possibility and damage. And obviously, since then, the prefecture and the region has been really trying hard to prepare for it. And of course, again, hard and soft measures. So one very famous example of hard measures is they created a huge tsunami towers. So in Tohoku area, they built tsunami dike. So the long coastal line, there is a massive barrier that from the other side, you cannot really see the coast in a sea. To avoid that from happening, this area chose to have these tsunami towers, the tall towers that you climb up to save your lives. And yes, it's the largest one, tallest one is 22 meters. So then, but you have to go there. And that's when this, soft side of this gets involved and people are asked to practice evacuating. In tsunami case, the time is very limited. So it is really a serious matter for the communities.
And so what kind of advance notice would local populations have between some sort of alarm being triggered and them needing to get into these 22-meter tall towers to protect themselves?
Well, as soon as the earthquake hits, because tsunami is always mostly caused by earthquakes. So as soon as earthquake hits, then you have to evacuate immediately, and you have only not couple of minutes, but very short time. It's not like a day or two. No, you have to evacuate immediately. So just to clarify, we're talking. Sorry, I'm giving a lot of examples of tsunami and earthquakes, which are not really climate-related disasters. These are more geological disasters, so they are not caused by climate change. But I'm trying to explain the preparedness and then community involvement.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the education, the sort of knowledge provision that has to go on to protect people from earthquakes or typhoons or whatever it might be. What are the kind of things that policymakers in Japan or elsewhere need to focus on? Because, I mean, there are obvious parallels here with persuading people to get vaccines for, pandemics, for example, where, plenty of people, despite the science being quite clear for many age groups, just are not convinced that this is in their interest to get it. Presumably there are some similar challenges around tsunamis and so on.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a very good point. And there's a lot of discussion amongst the DRR, disaster risk reduction community, about the COVID situation and how can we learn or how can we exchange the learning. Yes, the convincing, persuading, motivating is the challenge. It's the challenge. And so when we talk about participatory approaches, loads been done and many participatory programs have been successful, but it is very difficult to motivate people before the disaster. There's a lot of research being done. Once you experience can motivate you. So if you're in Tohoku, everybody is motivated. Well, not everybody, many people are motivated. But if you haven't had a disaster yet, it's very difficult to foresee, motivate yourself. So that is a challenge. Either you persuade, you just explain. Loads of attempts have been done. But one of the theories I'm very much interested is to embed disaster preparedness in everyday life. If you separate the disaster preparedness from your daily activities, for example, you have to spend Sunday to practice evacuation or practice flooding drills, then, you feel like you're losing a day off and, you would rather go to a nice, party or park. Yeah, so instead of doing that, how can you embed this as your daily routine activity? So that kind of shift in thinking is more attractive in terms of how you can engage people. So in a lot of interesting innovative ideas, you can combine, I don't know, festivals with disaster preparedness activities. If you have some kind of forums, you can combine that kind of ideas.
Yeah, it strikes me that Mary Kennedy, the American academic, describes motivating pupils as one of the persistent challenges of teaching. And she has this nice phrase that, education, as in schooling, is mandatory, but learning is not. And I mean, in your setting, you don't even have the mandatory part, right? This is lifelong learning, adult learning, as you say, outside of a school setting. And so even just getting people's attention is a challenge in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Having said that, a lot's been done in the field of education as well. So there is some countries do have disaster education in the curriculum, at school, because like, other subject areas, the earlier the better. So you start early from an early age. And I think places like New Zealand or Australia, they practice, drilling from, the nursery ages, early ages. And that is kind of research being done that is a very effective way, getting people prepared.
Interesting, interesting. And so, how did you? I know you now have a collaboration, Kaori, with the Disaster Prevention Research Institute in Kyoto, and you're talking to us today from Japan. How did that collaboration get going, and what kind of work are you doing there?
Yes, so this is actually exactly about participation. And I have started to wonder, we talk a lot about participation, lots been done, but one, participation is not the solution, it's not a panacea. And two, it might look like people are participating, but it's not really, because they are told to participate and they are just there. And three, there might be a different degrees of participation. So I want to pilot looking at a couple of cases, fields in Japan, and see if there is any different degrees of participation in different kind of participatory DRR activities. And there is a colleague at Kyoto University Disaster Prevention Research Institute who is also interested in the theory and practice of participation. So we developed this collaborative opportunity, and hopefully this is a pilot, and we want to kind of apply for bigger funding to continue the research.
Best of luck with that. I mean, what concretely? What would these? Your pilot projects. How does the participation work? I mean, is it like a town hall meeting, or is it done online? How do you actually go about getting communities involved in this stuff?
Yeah. So again, my positionality is I research a piece of research. So I have picked a few cases of participatory projects that have already been done, whether successful or not, that's done. So I go into communities, see what outcomes are. Sometimes it could be a kind of evacuation centers, it could be a communal activity, it could be more kind of planning manual, whatever that is. And then hoping to speak to a range of stakeholders to get them reflect on the participation itself. Hopefully that would to me to some kind of idea. And that on my side, I'm linking that with public pedagogy that I'm kind of founding. My foundation is public pedagogical perspectives.
Can you just define that for us, Kaori? What is public pedagogy?
Again, it's the learning settings outside of and beyond formal settings. But the difference between lifelong learning public pedagogy, as far as I understand it, is public pedagogy has a kind of political emphasis. So the lifelong learning just describes either it's a time scale or the space. You can learn anytime, anywhere. But public pedagogy focuses on agency and also the self-organized aspects of the activity, and then the collectivity of the activity itself. So I think that public pedagogy suits much better than lifelong learning in looking at disaster risk reduction. That's why I'm focusing on it now. But this is all kind of work in progress. Let's see, what happens.
I was very struck there, Kaori, by your point that people are much more likely to sort of appreciate risk and perhaps change their behavior if they see that risk realized. So being involved in a natural disaster, a forest fire, or a typhoon might help people be more prepared for it next time or something. But that is slightly concerning in a way, right? Because it suggests, in the context of climate change, that we might have to wait for things to get really bad before people seriously change their behavior and cut emissions, or before the leaders meeting at COP26 or subsequent meetings really take some radical action to prevent further climate change. Is there anything else we can do to sort of shortcut that process and prepare before the disaster happens rather than afterwards?
That is a big challenge, and we hope if we could do that. Some researchers are working on this idea of based on vicarious learning. That is about you yourself don't necessarily experience it, but when you see people close to you have experience, then you learn from the other person's experience. Or through media, if the documentary programs are done very well, you learn from watching it. It becomes yours, that. So how close can you get? You may not be overlap completely, but if you could get as close as possible, then you can motivate. People can be motivated. People can get involved. So I think this is a very important point. And one professor in social psychology in Japan said to me that we have to use the culture of the country as well, the people as well. So, for example, in Japan, people like to do what other people are doing. So if your neighbors are really engaging in any disaster preparedness activities, then people might feel, oh, because he is or she is doing, I better do it too. So that can have an impact as well. So we have to use as many tools, approaches as possible to get as many people as possible to involved, to engage.
Yeah, it totally makes sense to me that I don't necessarily have to experience it myself, but if I experience other people that I care about and know about, then it kind of brings it home and makes it real. And I know that, yeah, in other areas of life, like persuading people to use less energy, for example, there have been survey experiments where people have been sent letters saying, oh, you use 15% more electricity than your neighbors in a similarly sized house, kind of thing. And that's led people to cut their electricity consumption, presumably by turning lights off or taking the TV off standby, in order to move towards the local norm and what their neighbors and friends are doing. So I guess it's the same kind of logic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And COVID situation has taught us the same. That I haven't had it, but if somebody close to me, friends had it, and that kind of warns me, doesn't it? I have to be more cautious. So it's really there that we better take the advantage of. Yes.
Kaori, how can universities, do you think, play a role in addressing the climate crisis? This is the sort of central challenge of our generation. And universities, we work at a university called the Institute of Education, right? How can we play a role in helping to educate the public more broadly beyond, the students that actually attend the university?
Yes, that's a very important question. I would emphasize two things. One is to really actualize interdisciplinarity. We talk a lot about interdisciplinary, and we are encouraged to work with colleagues across different faculties, but that's not so easy. And many of us are working in interdisciplinary areas, but I think how can we make it happen is not necessarily straightforward. So I think somehow we need to do it better. I don't know, by promoting more interesting programs. And also by doing so, we can bring these research materials in our teachings. So we can, with a connected curriculum, we can connect our research, interdisciplinary research, with our teaching. So in the field of education, our modules can be consisted of various areas. It doesn't have to be focused on education, particularly looking at climate change related agendas. So that's one area. And then the other thing is we need to go out to communities, I believe. I know it's been done. We are, again, encouraged to engage with the public, but it's more kind of really how to bottom up. It's not to bring the university knowledge to communities, but how can we really listen to what they know, what they want to do, what they need to do, and work together. And I think, just to mention another project I'm involved, which is transforming universities for changing climate. We are doing that exactly. So we are working with communities across different countries and try and develop a range of innovative participatory approaches those communities really need. So if we could do more of these bottom-up engagement, I think that would be really useful.
Okay, thanks, Kaori. And just one last question then. We've got COP26 happening this month. How optimistic are you feeling about whether leaders will commit to the necessary level of emissions reductions? Do you think they can do it?
I believe so. They have to. They have to. We don't have other option. Oh, by the way, you might know the Nobel Prize winner. One of them was Japanese professor, 90 years old. He was the person who kind of advocated climate change phenomena 50 years ago, and it's been a big news in Japan, obviously. But it took us so long. But now I think time is ticking. I believe that all leaders are aware of that.
That's a much needed dose of optimism for us there. Thanks for that. Kaori Kitagawa, it's been really interesting and also at times slightly scary talking to you today. And thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity.
You can find out more about Kaori's research by Googling her UCL profile page, and we'll also stick a link to that in the show notes, or by following @UCL_global on Twitter. We've had some fascinating guests on the podcast with a real variation of topics and expertise across the social sciences and education. If you want to hear more of these episodes, search IOE Podcasts from wherever you get your podcasts, and you can now find episodes from seasons 1 to 10 of Research in the Real World, as well as other podcasts from the Institute of Education. If you have questions or topics you'd like us to address in future interview, follow the links in the show notes where you can record your questions or suggestions for topics using either voice or text. And as an added bonus, you can find the Research for the Real World playlist featuring tracks contributed by previous guests and producers. Follow the links to Spotify in the show notes. I'm Sam Sims, and this has been Research for the Real World. Goodbye.
Research for the Real World is brought to you by the IOE Marketing and Communications team,
in association with IOE Research Development.
This podcast is presented by me, Dr. Carrie Wong,
and me, Dr. Sam Sims.
The theme music was created by Rob Cochran.
Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor.
Amy Leibowitz is the series producer.
And Jason Illigan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London. Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.